Today, we dive into how Muwekma was a federally recognized tribe in the early 20th century and why we are currently not on the list of federally recognized tribes today. Even though our status was never terminated, and even though our community continues to live and work and die on the same lands our ancestors called home for thousands of years. If Muwekma's ancestors had settled somewhere other than this beautiful Bay Area of ours, we wouldn't face the same political opposition to restoring our status that we do today. Senator Feinstein made it crystal clear to me that she would not support what she called an urban tribe. For decades, the senator has been opposed to Muwekma, not because of our evidence or legitimacy, but because of our location. Our Aboriginal lands' beauty and wealth of natural resources was the main reason we were enslaved by the missions, by the Spanish in the missions here in the Bay Area, and why the new state of California back in 1848 went into debt paying the bounties to hunt and kill my people. These lands are too valuable to have us Indians living on them. Of course, today, our Aboriginal lands are occupied by some of the wealthiest companies in human history. Our homeland is considered the center of the universe when it comes to innovation, technology, and wealth creation. These companies generate immense wealth while occupying unceded Muwekma lands, never asking the question, what happened to the Ohlone Indians? These billion-dollar companies turn a blind eye to our injustice because they don't want to justify their unintentional role in our political erasure, in the gentrification of our 10,000-year-old homeland, and our continued colonization. Political erasure is what we faced in the early 1900s when they labeled us the Verona Band after a railroad station built on the homelands of Phoebe Hearst. It's what we faced in 1927 when an Indian agent took us off the list to receive land because he unilaterally decided we did not need land. They thought if they ignored us and displaced us from our lands, we would simply disappear, assimilate, move away, or die off. They don't understand the deep connections we have to our lands and the duty we have to protect our ancestors who rest beneath our lands. If we weren't here in 1965, who would have saved our Ohlone Cemetery from Caltrans, who tried to put a road through it? If we weren't here during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, who would have stood up for our dead relatives who were being displaced from their resting places because of the mass development? Political erasure is what we faced in the past, and it's what we face today when cities and counties in our Aboriginal territory refuse to acknowledge our history and our presence and our existence today. Last month, Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors President Susan Ellenberg committed to pass a resolution in support of our federal recognition. But days later, she quickly changed that position and now, for some reason, is in opposition of supporting our tribe. California State Senator Dave Cortese and 5 other Bay Area state delegations sponsored legislation that would have allowed California to support our restoration of our federal recognition status, SGR 13. But special interests in the form of Great Rancheria and other gaming tribes interfered and lobbied Chairman Bill Dodd of the Government of Organization Committee. Dodd gave in to the special interests and refused to bring SJR 13 to a vote, effectively killing the bill in his committee. The chairman of Great Rancheria, Greg Sayers, has spent tens of millions of dollars opposing and oppressing my people. donating to institutions and politicians to gain favor and support against our efforts. This is not a secret. I say shame on Greg Saris. When he was a student at Stanford, he worked with other students to get the Muwekma Ohlone House named after our tribe. And now, he and other special interests work to suppress our voice and oppress our people. The noblest of pursuits are the ones that consider the truth as their guiding light, guiding principle. And it breaks my heart to see my Native brothers and sisters turning away from the truth and working so hard to continue obstructing our efforts and the efforts of other legitimate, unrecognized tribes because of greed and possessions. They truly, I believe, have lost their way. Special interests and political erasure go hand in hand. If there was no interests or money involved, there would be no reason for politicians or institutions to ignore us or attempt to erase our presence. Take, for example, my efforts to engage our Bay Area congressional delegation in sponsoring legislation to restore our status. It took me 3 years, that's 36 months, just to get Representative Zoe Lofgren to respond to my dozens of phone calls and emails asking to meet. Imagine that, a congresswoman who doesn't respond to her constituents. It wasn't any better with Representative Barbara Lee, who still refuses to meet with me and answer my calls and answer my emails, even though she is running for Senate and built her political career on Muwekma land. Why do politicians continue to ignore Muwekma when the evidence and documentation clearly point to our legitimacy and as a sovereign nation? It is no secret that special interest casino tribes and local Bay Area card rooms do not want Muwekma recognized because they fear any possibility of competition. But why do politicians do the bidding of these special interests? This question is not meant to be naive. I do understand why, but I ask the question, why do we allow it? We need to elect leaders who represent us and share our same values, not politicians who serve corporate interests. I want to really stress that Muwekma has 2 viable paths toward restoration of our status. I say restoration because we don't need recognition. We were already recognized, and our status was never terminated by Congress. One viable path is through Congress. Congress can pass legislation to restore our status. Since 1970, Congress has federally recognized or reaffirmed 26 tribes. This includes tribes that were terminated and denied recognition in the federal acknowledgement process. A second viable path is through administrative correction. Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland or Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs Brian Newland can restore our status with a simple letter correcting the BIA's mistake and adding us to the official list of recognized tribes. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, has restored 3 other California tribes in the same situation as Muwekma. One last point before we hear from the experts. I wanted to share my thoughts on the federal acknowledgement process. Today, you will hear about the federal acknowledgement process and how it was created to acknowledge the existence of tribes who were never recognized. It was not created for tribes like Muwekma, who had been previously recognized and never terminated. So one must ask the question, why was Muwekma made to go through this process in the first place? I continue to ask that question, and no one has a good answer. You will also likely hear how the BIA made mistakes in the analysis of Muwekma's evidence, how they restricted evidence prior to 1927 and after 1985 from consideration, how they ignored or misconstrued evidence because they didn't look at any of the evidence of the tribe's origins. They didn't analyze the entire body of evidence that supports a positive determination. For those who claim that the FAP process is fair, I want to read you testimony from Bud Shepard. On September 15, 1992, John Bud Shepard, former branch of acknowledgement of BAR, the branch of acknowledgement and research from 1978 to 1988, he's the primary author of the acknowledgement regulations, worked after his retirement as a consultant for 5 petitioning groups. Shepard's experience on the other side of the petitioning process led him to make the following statement to a congressional committee, and I quote, "After 14 years of trying to make the regulations which I drafted in 1978 work, I must conclude that they are fatally flawed and unworkable. They take too long to produce results. They are administratively too complicated. The decisions are subjective and are not necessarily accurate. The criteria are limited in scope and are not applicable to many of the petitioning groups, which are in fact valuable Indian tribes. To continue to operate under the present regulations or any legislative approximation will not resolve the question of unrecognized Indian tribes in this country. The present regulations cannot be revised, fixed, patched, dabbled with, redefined, clarified, or administered differently to make them work. Additional money, staff, computer hardware, or contracts with outside organizations will not solve the problem. The problem lies within the regulations. In short, the regulations should be scrapped in their entirety and replaced with a simpler, less burdensome, and more objective solution. They should be administered by an independent agency that does not have a vested interest in the already recognized Indian tribes. So, if anyone tells you that all the tribes must go through the federal acknowledgement process to prove their existence, remember what Bud Shepard's testimony to Congress. Thank you for listening, and I'm hoping you will learn something from the symposium that will bring clarity to a broken and corrupted process. Thank you so much.